Railroad engineers, have you ever come across anything creepy or weird on the tracks while driving your train? I have two stories from third parties. I worked as a cook for a retired railroad engineer as my first high school job. In his old age, he built a barbecue restaurant in front of his house in this little country valley near Warner, Oklahoma. He said that the worst thing that ever happened to him was hitting a car that was crossing the tracks without looking both ways first. In the old days, there were not crossbars at every location, especially in the rural areas. He could not see the mother driver, but her child was standing in the passenger seat staring into his eyes all the way up to the point that he smashed right into her. None survived. He still had nightmares about it. He has passed away now for about 10 years, hopefully resting in peace. The other time, a few of my friends had crossed some tracks to get from one strip mall to another in Muskogee, Oklahoma. On their way back, they were just hanging out in this train underpass, talking, when a train went by with its brakes screeching. About 30 minutes later, the railroad police, yes, this is a real thing, yelled at them from the bridge over a loudspeaker to present themselves. They were all arrested, booked into the city jail, and released with misdemeanor fines of $850. Apparently, you cannot be on railroad property unless it's a legal crossing, and the train was forced to stop even though they weren't anywhere near it. My friend told me the engineer was there to personally scold him for forcing the train to stop. I used to hop freight trains. I spent a lot of time walking tracks all over the United States and Canada. I adopted a baby opossum that I found with its dead mother, and I've seen countless deer carcasses. A friend of mine lost her leg in Kansas City. One time while sitting in a boxcar outside Las Vegas, some dude jumped in and asked if he could ride, and we told him as long as he didn't try anything stupid, we kept it safe. He agrees. As we're rolling out of town, we look out the door and see a car on fire and cops and ambulances everywhere. This guy set that on fire, and now he was in our car. We kicked him off several hours later in the Colton, California yard. My dad worked for BNSF for 43 years before he retired 4 years ago. He was a yard master, but still saw some pretty strange stuff. Two stories that immediately jumped to mind. A young couple in the 70s were making out on the platform before an Amtrak train was taking off. The girl was supposed to be inside, but she kept making out with her boyfriend all the way up to and past the last calls before departure. The train was leaving the station when she realized she wasn't on board. For some reason, she decided to jump onto one of the ladders and just hold on. This was a train leaving Blaine, Washington and heading to Seattle. A good chunk of time before it would stop. My dad happened to be out inspecting something totally unrelated and was the only railroad employee to see this happen. He had to rush back to the station in order to radio the conductor and stop the train. People drove out to where the train stopped, and the girl was alive, but in such a state of shock. Her hands were so tightly wrapped to the ladder that she could not let go. I don't remember how long it took them to get her to be able to physically let go, but it wasn't easy. Another time, he was doing an inspection in Sandpoint, Idaho shortly after I was born, so the early 80s. He came across a family living in a train car. Of course, the policy is to not allow this sort of thing. He was supposed to call the cops and have them arrested for trespassing, squatting, etc. Instead, he told them that he was not going to do anything, but if someone else caught them, they would probably be removed pretty aggressively. Oh, and one more story I just thought of. When working in Blaine, he would be the last point of contact for trains entering or coming from Canada. He was supposed to inspect all the proper forms for customs and such, also back in the 1970s. Strange that a non-government employee would do this. He found one car that did not have everything properly filled out, so he had to deny entry. It turns out that the CEO of the company who had that freight was a personal friend of the CEO of Burlington Northern, so he actually got a personalized letter from the CEO of Burlington Northern informing him that he made a grave mistake and that any similar action delaying transport for his friend would result in the loss of my dad's job. Dad probably could have been praised as a whistleblower, but it was a drastically different time. During this time, the railroad would also change the currency in which he was paid depending on which had lower value, the loonie or the United States dollar. I used to be an engineer for a tourist railroad. I had a car run in front of me while running steam that was so close it had to be in the space between the coupler and the front beam of the engine, my whistle screaming the entire time. I've had a herd of deer pacing alongside my headlight at night in the fog at 25 miles per hour for at least a mile while running an old Alco S2. Another time a deer ran in front of the train, jumped an 8-foot-high fence that had a 10-foot drop and a small stream on the other side. It must have been fine because we didn't see it anywhere injured. I've seen weird green flashes of light at night like strange lightning that my conductor and I saw but no one else did. I ran into a local townsperson who once told me that during the off-season, he climbed into our steam locomotive and fired a bunch of shotgun rounds into the firebox because he did not like the pollution from the engine. The dumbass was lucky a ricochet did not kill him. We broke up a party of teenagers alongside the tracks where one guy was getting some intimate favors from one of the girls. Got held up for a marathon one time. Local police were trying to block us from going through the road crossing. We waited just to be good neighbors, but railroads are covered under federal law, and we could have started rolling anytime we felt like it. Mostly kids waving, occasional debris on the track, and cars being real stupid. Occasional glimpses of intimate moments going on through the windows of houses. I worked in a rail yard. Not out on the rails themselves as an engineer or conductor, but we saw a few interesting things. My buddy saw what he thought was a black garbage bag lying inside the well of an intermodal car. We have to remove any debris, as the shipping containers won't fit in properly. He reached in to grab it and quickly pulled it up only to discover it was a dead vulture. Feathers fell off, and he dropped it and began screaming and running down the tracks. I was hysterical. I told him he still had to get it because it was on his side of the train. The best story, though, was working the overnight shift. A train came in and was parked. A few hours later, I see a disheveled man walking around looking lost. I had heard stories that we occasionally still get hobos riding the rails. And this gentleman was my first. Official railroad policy is to call the cops and have them arrested for trespassing. But the unwritten rule was if it appeared they were not trying to steal or vandalize anything, to just escort them off property. I asked the guy if he was looking for the exit, and he said he was. I pointed it out to him, and he thanked me. He turns and says, "Hey man, where the hell am I? I've been riding the rails all day, fell asleep. I had to get the hell out of Baltimore." I looked at him and said, "Baltimore." He looked confused. Apparently, he got on the train at the rail yard across town, rode over to a classification yard, fell asleep, and woke up in our yard across town. 6 hours and he had gone about 5 miles. He was pissed. I was trying not to laugh as he was muttering to himself out the gate. Not an engineer, but as a substance abuse counselor, I had a caseload of engineers/conductors who were sent to 90-day rehab. Most of these guys belonged to the union and were mandated to dry out after failing a random urine test. About 90% of the men I worked with had developed very serious addiction issues over the years due to the loneliness and solitude of the schedule that pretty much sets them apart from family for days at a time. An engineer/conductor would typically receive notification on the same day and be out for 3 or more days, one day conducting a 100-plus boxcar train, 1, 2, or 3 nights in a motel, then one day conducting another 100-plus boxcar train back to the original station. In addition to the solitude and loneliness, these guys had yet another basic similarity in the horrific fact that each person had their own terrifying memory of killing someone by hitting them in various ways with the train that they were conducting. Session after session, case after case, these men would disclose to me that they couldn't escape the memory of the first time someone stalled out on the train tracks and wouldn't get out of their car, or were walking on the tracks, or tried to beat the train but came up short and got hit, or were walking on tracks opposite a train and not realizing another train was coming up from behind, and they had to drink or use dope to escape. The primary issue each man had was that the train is just unable to stop fast enough. It was definitely an eye-opening experience, never knew that side of the railroad. Conductor of passenger rail here. Now, that means I don't see nearly as much railroad as engineers/freight conductors, but I've seen enough. There isn't so much as creepy anymore because a lot of things that happen up there are so common, hitting people, hitting every type of wildlife ever, and seeing people where you never thought someone would be at 3 a.m. because they like trains. The only thing that still makes me uncomfortable, other than trespasser strikes that are kids or non-suicides, is when it's super foggy out. Now when visibility is limited and you're still going 70+ into a wall of fog, I have to leave the head end. It's something about the speed and not knowing what's 100 feet ahead of you and having full faith in the signals and equipment. I am a freight conductor. We hit a young lady walking between the two main tracks at around 5 in the morning. That was awful, and seeing a lifeless person is unsettling on its own, but the craziest part was that I thought we hit two different people. The woman that I saw was white, heavy-set, and in her late 40s. She was walking toward the train, leaning out in front of us. When the brakeman and I walked back to find the woman, what we found did not match what I saw. She did not go under the train, so she was mostly in one piece. We found a Latina woman who was very thin, and I later found out she was in her early 20s. Now, I thought I was crazy, but the brakeman started asking me if we had hit two people and described the woman in her 40s the same way I had seen her. Needless to say, we only hit one person, but he and I were convinced that this young girl was possessed by some evil entity. The face I saw before we hit her still pops into my mind occasionally. It was evil, twisted, and full of pain. I was working at a BNSF railway in Stockton, California, maintaining the cranes that pull cars off the tracks when a freight engine rolled in with the front end a little caved in, covered in red. The entire front end was covered in what appeared to be red chunks, a paste leftover from rolling through maybe a herd of cattle, or a horde of zombies. I didn't know what to think. I felt my stomach churn, and my coworker turned green and heaved a bit. I asked the foreman what happened. He told me some teenager jumped out in front of it. Later, I grew a pair and walked up to it as these folks were cleaning it without any signs of being affected by the sight. Turns out the train hit a stalled fiberglass trailer filled with tomatoes that was headed to the Hunt's Cannery in Oakdale. I have two stories. One, I work in the electric traction department of Amtrak in the Northeast. One night we had a report of wire theft in a remote location along the Harrisburg Run, and we were sent out to investigate. Typically, the work crews get there before the police, so we'll usually hang back a bit until the men with guns get there in case the perpetrator is still there. We show up and see some wire hanging and some guy lying on the ground. We assumed he hit a live wire, got fried, and is now dead. We walk up and shout to the guy, but we don't get a response. After about 10 minutes, the police show up and start taking pictures of the scene. One cop grabbed a stick and poked the dead guy a few times just to make sure. No movement, definitely dead. The cop with the camera takes a picture of the dead guy. When the flash goes off, the dead guy jumps up, screams the loudest scream I've ever heard, and takes off running. The cop with the stick starts chasing after him with the stick above his head, while his partner and our crew just stand there trying to figure out what the hell just happened. 2. I was on a standby crew at night during a storm with two other guys. I was put on a piece of equipment called a cat car, while the other two guys decided to hang out in the truck. With the cat car running to keep it warm, I decided to lock up and take a nap. I locked both doors with padlocks on the inside so there was no way anyone could get in without me letting them in. A few hours later, I awoke to some heavy wind and decided to check with the other guys to see if our supervisor had called with any trouble. When I got to the door, the lock was missing, but I couldn't open the door. The same with the other door. I called the other guys to come help, and when they got there, they asked how I managed to lock the cat car from the outside. If you're not quite following that, the padlocks that were originally on the inside, locking the only two doors into the equipment, were now on the outside. The three of us couldn't figure out what happened, but it creeped me the hell out. My uncle's best friend was a conductor/engineer for a train years ago. He told me that one night he was going up through North Florida and saw some deer on the tracks, so he lay on the horn to scare them off. All but one ran off the tracks. The last one ran in front of the train, along the tracks. He had to try to slow the train slightly to keep from running the deer over, but couldn't. The train caught up with the deer and he lost sight of it, believing he had just run it over. When he got to the next city and slowed down for a turn, he noticed something on the side of the engine. He leaned out to see the deer laying on a set of steps just out of view from his seat. It ended up jumping off in the middle of the city, a few hundred miles from its home. Conductor here. One time in the middle of the night in the middle of winter, 10 degrees and a foot of snow on the ground, my train went into emergency. I had to walk the length of the train to see what the problem was. The train was right in the middle of a very small town. As I'm walking by one of the houses on the outskirts of this town, I see a guy standing in the driveway about 50 feet from me wearing a trench coat and a sock hat type thing. The first thing that struck me as odd is that it was way too cold to be wearing just a trench coat. I shine my lantern on the guy, wave, and say, "Hi." Nothing. The guy doesn't even move. I continue walking past the guy to the end of the train while looking back very often. I get to the end, turn around, and head back. I get back to the house where this guy is standing, and he is still there in the same place in the same position. I don't even say anything this time. I just speed walk back to the head of the train. The next day, I'm taking a train back home during the day. I'm paying special attention to this house as we go by it. There is nothing there. The drive isn't shoveled. Nothing is there that could have been mistaken for a guy in a trench coat. I have since been by this house dozens of times and I have never seen a car parked there, or a light on, or anything at all. I work as a backup janitor when the normal one isn't available. I've seen some very weird things at the places I've cleaned. There's the usual needles and beer cans, not that shocking after a while, but the weirdest thing I have ever seen was when I was called out to a train yard to clean out some disused engines. These things hadn't been used since the mid-90s and were going to be sold for scrap as they were too battered to be refurbished. I was warned beforehand that there might be a bum in one of them, but I brushed it off since I had seen many bums at the various places I cleaned. They usually just ran off when they saw me coming. So I picked up my bucket and got in the company truck to go out to the disused part of the yard where the trains were, routine janitorial duties. As I am driving out there, I noticed that I left the keys to the trains back at the office. Oh well, I figure, these things are so old that the door might not even be there anymore. So I drive out to the engines, park my truck, and get out. Nothing is creepy at this point, just some rotting diesel engines. I had seen much creepier things before. I walk up the railing and kick in the door with little force. It didn't even have a lock anymore. I walk in and I immediately notice something very odd. It is in near mint condition. Great, I think, one less room to clean. But then I notice something very, very disturbing, a skeleton perched against a wall. Then I notice that it's wearing a leather jacket and clutching a pill bottle in its bony hands. I walk a bit closer and grab the pill bottle from its hand. The prescription date was October 9th, 96, over 10 years ago. This guy had been in a train for 10 years and nobody noticed his absence. I pressed the button on my radio and told the guard to call the cops. There's a dead guy in here and he's been here for a decade. About 5 minutes later, a cop car pulls up and an off-duty cop steps out and walks up to the train. Turns out that this man had been missing since 1997 and nobody cared enough to look for him. He was an elderly man who lost his wife and offed himself in a train. He lay there for 11 years and was never disturbed. When they buried him a few days later, I was the only one to come. All of his family was dead or didn't care enough to come. Sad and creepy. A few answers to this. Warning, detail and gore get worse as this goes. First, some background. During the 80s I worked as an engineer and conductor and track maintenance and derailment wreck master for a small railroad services company. We worked freight only, but I had friends and I took many rides on some of the fast-moving passenger trains, USA Northeast Corridor. My own fond memory was the two halves of the same turtle, one on each side of the track. Shell and bones mostly, likely placed there intentionally by someone before me, honest. I just could not bring myself to disturb it, and eventually it became a memorable visual marker along the tracks for me. Freight tracks are often out in the middle of nothing and nowhere, just trees and weeds, so a friendly, albeit long dead, familiar face was welcome. There is a lot of boring time out on the railroad. Now, on to the gory bits some are asking about. I've been in the cab of a passenger train engine hauling fast up around 150 miles per hour. During daylight, visibility is usually decent if the weather is not too bad. Point is, during the day, you can at least see what you are about to hit and can phone in an adequate report of, "I just hit what seemed to be a washing machine that is now about an eighth of a mile east of the tracks," that sort of thing. At night, though, yuck. The locomotive has one really big headlamp that lights up probably more than a quarter mile in front of you. Above 100 miles per hour, that's an entire fraction of a second to glimpse the dark figure your train is going to hit. The bugs dying on the windshield are constant at night. Basically, every square inch of windshield is taking a bug hit about once a minute. Lots of wiper fluid, zips up and off the windshield real quick at those speeds, lots of windshield wiper use, lots of streaky squished bug bits getting blown up and towards the edge of the windshield. Real glamorous stuff. Impacting machinery is a bit unnerving because you worry about the metal bits getting in your wheel sets or communications gear. Mostly, though, you hear a dull thump and some really dented metal box flies away from you. Why morons find entertainment by putting appliances on rail used by fast trains is beyond me. But hitting vertebrates, yeah, those are always a mess. The little birds make red circles on the windshield, and the red circle just expands and gets blown towards the edges of the windshield. Sometimes you see red streaking on your side door window, and you just know your outside door handle has some on it. Larger birds make a decent thunk and you, unfortunately, can see enough of the bits to tell you just splattered a swan or a goose or similar. Deer are uneventful hits, low enough that it's mostly in the wheels, below the sight of the passengers on the elevated platform you will next pull in and stop at. The cows are pretty nasty. They have enough mass that there is a decent sound on impact, a bit of a hollow wet thwunk, and they leave a pretty bad mess on the front of the engine. But the human suicides, those haunt you. For some reason, the women often choose a white dress, just stand there as the racing train comes at them, usually holding their arms outstretched to the side, usually looking up. You see the impact coming, you emergency brake all you can. On an 8+ car train over 100 miles per hour with a quarter second's notice, you can take maybe 1.3 miles per hour off the speed of impact. You leave the brakes on full, stopping a couple miles later. You radio in the accident. The worst is when, identifiable remains are on your engine. Grim stuff. Sorry for the messes described. I witnessed another train, about half a mile from me, hit one of those port potty service trucks, basically a small tanker truck full of literal crap. Quite the sight, and then I hauled away from there as fast as I could, just praying to outrun the smell. Basically, rail work in the 80s was a bit like image searching the web for nasty sites, but in real life, for a paycheck, and most of the nasty sights you did not want to see.